Henry Ford celebrated 75 years on Earth with a party that lasted for 2 days. It began with an army of little girls, a cake that was very, very large, and whatever this is. There were weird ethnic mascots, an old-timey carriage ride around his old-timey town, and a play where live actors depicted scenes from his life for his own amusement. The next day, he was rewarded for a lifetime of dedication, industrial prowess, and zealous activism. At his company headquarters on the 75th anniversary of his birth, Henry Ford received a medal from Adolf Hitler. It was the highest honor Hitler could give to a foreign supporter. It's a strikingly terrible object. But why Ford? What had this American industrialist done to so endear himself to Adolf Hitler? What could he possibly have in common with a fascist that relied on bigotry and brute force to gain power and crush dissent? I'm gonna tell you. That's what the video is about. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and prepare to learn a thing or two or 10. The myth that's been built around Henry Ford has fascinated me for years. His birthplace is now a public park dedicated to him, which is a few hundred feet from a different park named after him. That park is next to a Ford office complex that sits along Ford Road, and that office is across the street from a Target. That Target is next to a Five Below, and that Five Below is right down the street from Ford Motor Company headquarters. He created the auto industry, invented the assembly line, pioneered the living wage, and manufactured America's victory in World War II. He saw the Model T in a dream and cast his first engine block using iron from his own blood. We remember him like some kind of great-granddaddy Superman. We cling to memories of the good times and seal away the off-the-cuff slurs and that time he teamed up with Darkseid or killed Jimmy Olsen or whatever. We just suppress all those bad memories and lock them up in the same place we keep state capitals we've never been to and U.S. presidents who aren't on money. The Ford we do remember is as manufactured as the cars that defined his career. His legacy as a capitalist folk hero emerged from a lifelong campaign of self-promotion. Ford knew the power of a good story, and used any coverage he could get to sell himself as a supporter of average, everyday people. So we need to sift through a lot of stuff that's been deliberately left on the cutting room floor. When you look into his use of the media, his treatment of his workers, and all of his company's activity during World War II, you'll reveal a man who was so deeply flawed that he gained the admiration of the literal worst person of the 20th century. The 1910s were a great time to be Henry Ford. His company was seeing record profits, and his adoption of the $5 a day wage and 40-hour workweek had begun to establish Ford's persona as the compassionate industrialist he's commonly known as today. The release of the Model T had changed the auto industry, and by this point Ford was definitely starting to believe his own hype. As his company grew and rapid industrialization transformed America, Henry Ford's curmudgeonly nature was slowly twisting him into a stubborn, controlling old asshole. When his company introduced the $5 a day wage, it was only granted conditionally. To get it, you had to let Ford's army of sociological investigators monitor you constantly, both within and outside of the workplace. If you were caught drinking, smoking, living with an unmarried partner, or violating any of their other many restrictions, you were disqualified from higher wages and potentially fired on the spot. If you were a foreign-born worker, you were required to attend English classes before or after your normal shifts. Learning English could have been great for these workers, but unfortunately none of this was really meant to expand their skills. Ford didn't hire them for their growth potential. He hired them to screw down the same lug nut 10,000 times a day. Upon graduation, you had to dress up in a costume representing your country of origin, jump into a literal melting pot, and emerge as a proper American waving an American flag. Working at Ford was quickly changing from a transaction of compensation for labor to a relationship that allowed Henry Ford to control every aspect of workers' lives. It was the beginning of an unsettling exertion of power that would last for years at the Ford Motor Company. During this time, Ford also began pushing out anyone in his management team who dared to challenge him on anything, including his company's general manager, James Couzens. Couzens was the one who first pitched the 8-hour workday and $5 wage. He sold them to Ford as a way to reduce rising assembly line turnover and generate positive publicity. His management is widely thought to have helped the Ford Motor Company succeed where Henry Ford's earlier business ventures had failed. Upon his resignation in October 1915, he vented his frustrations with Ford to a close friend, telling them, "A man sometimes gets to a point where his freedom of thought and independence is greater than all else." While he was pushing to completely remake his company in his own image, Ford was also becoming increasingly hostile to any criticism he faced outside his organization. After a piece in the Chicago Tribune used a lot of fancy words to call him a big stupid idiot, Ford immediately sued the paper for defamation. During the trial, attorneys for the Tribune called Ford to testify, asking him basic questions about American history, such as what year the Revolutionary War took place, or who Benedict Arnold was. Ford went on to win the case, but his victory turned out to be a deeply hollow one. When he asked the court for $1 million in damages, the judge would conclude the proceedings by sarcastically awarding him a total of 6 cents. The negative press he received from the trial made him look far more ignorant and petty than he had appeared in the original article. It was one of the first in a series of cracks that began to show up in his curated public image. And in Henry Ford's mind, there was only one explanation whenever reality started catching up with him. Anything bad that happened to him had to be caused by... oh, god damn it. A cabal of Jewish bankers who are out to destroy Christianity, all free nations of the earth, and his very profitable car company. Some historians trace Henry Ford's earliest exposure to anti-Semitism to his rural upbringing in Dearborn, Michigan. Back then, it was an insular farming community a few miles outside the city of Detroit. It's possible that if Ford had never left Dearborn to try his hand at engineering downtown, he may have never even met an actual Jewish person. Many European immigrants brought superstitions about Jews with them when they came to America, and the prejudice Ford may have picked up from some of them would stick with him for the rest of his life. On November 17, 1915, Henry Ford held a meeting in Highland Park with some of his staff and Rosika Schwimmer, a Jewish activist from Hungary known for fighting for women's suffrage and peace in Europe. Ford had brought her in looking for ways that he might use his influence to help end the Great War. The meeting led to a plan to commission a peace ship to take a handful of notable people overseas and naively attempt to broker an end to the conflict single-handedly. As plans for the expedition were being discussed, Ford brought a dead stop to the conversation with an unexpected outburst.
I know who caused the war. The German Jewish bankers. I have the evidence here,
he declared, slapping his breast pocket.
Facts. I can't give out the facts now, because I haven't got them all yet. But I'll have them soon.
The room had been stunned into silence, and the voyage that emerged from the meeting left Ford with a serious case of the flu, no significant meetings with world leaders, and more bad press about his failure to subvert international diplomacy. But his claim about compiling anti-Semitic propaganda was very real, and Ford would begin an unrelenting campaign against Jews in the press just a few years later. While Ford was wrapped up in his peace ship meeting, Ernest Leibold, Ford's general secretary, was on vacation with his family in California. Leibold was widely known to keep tight tabs on access to Ford. Journalist Norman Hapgood once observed that Leibold has such a stranglehold over his employer that he practically decides whom Mr. Ford sees at all, and he is likely to remain in the room during any conference in which he wishes himself a predetermined outcome. When Leibold returned and learned about the meeting and Ford's anti-Semitic outburst, he concurred, stating that international business interests were playing behind the scenes to carry on the war for profit. Leibold's own upbringing in Detroit's German immigrant community had left him with a general admiration for Germany and his own virulent strain of anti-Semitism. It is widely believed that Leibold encouraged Ford's own anti-Semitic tendencies, and that he had helped codify the link in Ford's mind between Jews and the outbreak of war in Europe. By 1918, a 55-year-old Ford would try his hand at politics and broaden his reach into mass media, all the while still tightening his grip over his ever-expanding fiefdom of ceaseless mortal toil. He ran half-heartedly for U.S. Senate in Michigan and lost a tight race. Insisting the loss had been caused by yet another Jewish conspiracy, he tried to overturn it with an army of lawyers and private investigators, and ultimately learned a very dangerous lesson. Things outside his corporate bubble could easily slip through his fingers, but any organization he could buy was one he could totally control. In 1918, he purchased the Dearborn Independent. A struggling local paper at the time, Ford had big plans for its future. He wanted to distribute it nationally, seeking to establish a private apparatus for molding public opinion. The paper would become his platform to place mountains of blame onto those who he believed caused all the problems of the world. Once the acquisition was complete, Ford and Leibold got to work staffing the paper up and getting it ready for its unprecedented new run. To manage editorial, Ford hired Edwin G. Pipp, a well-respected editor from the Detroit News. Pipp would bring on Billy Cameron, a seasoned copywriter who had worked with him at the News. In January 1919, Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent would quietly begin publication. Under Pipp, the paper was a relatively normal weekly summary of national and world events. But as the year progressed, Ernest Leibold began clashing constantly with Pipp about the contents of the paper, and Pipp would find his editorial position overruled by Leibold for the first time in just a few months. In April 1919, Leibold brought in Boris Brassol to contribute to the Independent. Brassol immigrated to the U.S. from Russia after World War I. He had been a decorated member of the Imperial Russian Guard during the war, with deep ties to the former monarchist government. Edwin G. Pipp had reservations about giving a platform to such a nakedly self-interested foreign agent. But after pushing back hard against Leibold, Pipp was overruled, And on April 11th, 1919, Brassol published his first article in The Independent. Titled The Bolshevik Menace to Russia, it was among the first pieces in the paper attempting to tie Jewish people to the instability in Europe after the First World War. It would be a drop in the bucket compared to the torrent of bullshit that would spew forth from the paper in the very near future. As Leibold tightened his grip on The Independent, Ford was closing an iron fist around his automotive empire. In 1916, Ford had wanted to take the majority of the company's profits and spend them to expand his business around the world. Most of Ford's original investors, including Horace and John Dodge, wanted those profits distributed directly to the shareholders. By 1917, they had successfully sued Ford and forced him to pay out the dividends. Becoming even more intractable after the lawsuit, Ford vowed that he would never again lead a company that he couldn't completely control. In late 1918, Ford left his position as president of the Ford Motor Company. He cited his wish to work more closely on his newest ventures, including the Dearborn Independent. He appointed his 25-year-old son Edsel Ford to lead the company, but soon made it clear that he'd always have the final say in how the company was run. In March 1919, Ford drew massive attention by announcing a new competing car company, one which would build a better, cheaper car than the Model T. He had no actual plans to start another company, but he did want to create a panic to spook all of his existing shareholders. The media blitz he spun up was as effective as it was unethical. By July of 1919, he had spent about $100 million buying up every outstanding share of his company. For the first time in its history, the Ford Motor Company was completely controlled by the Ford family, and the Ford family was completely controlled by Henry Ford. Near the end of 1919, sales of The Independent were relatively soft, and Leibold's influence at the paper had undermined Pip's editorial autonomy completely. Joseph Jefferson O'Neill, another reporter Ford had hired previously to help him with his public image during the Tribune lawsuit, was tapped again for his thoughts on how to increase circulation of The Independent. The advice he would offer perfectly channeled into Ford and Leibold's ugliest impulses. Find an evil to attack, go after it, and stay after it. Ford's level of anti-Semitism was uncommon even during his time. You could talk to him about engineering, baseball, or the weather, and there was at least a chance that he might use the conversation as an opportunity to raise the Jewish question. In August 1919, on a camping trip with Harvey Firestone and his idol Thomas Edison, Ford was joined by John Burroughs, an American naturalist who shared his love of the outdoors. After a multi-course dinner served by a full waitstaff, Ford and his companions retreated to the campfire to unwind. In his private notes, Burroughs documents Ford's rantings to the group. "The Jews caused the war. The Jews caused the outbreak of thieving and robbery all across the country. The Jews caused the inefficiency of the Navy." Burroughs wouldn't publish the details of those notes within his lifetime, but he did allude to the incident in his public writings, stating simply, "Not much of the talk that night around the campfire can be repeated." Ford's many Jewish conspiracies weren't new or unique. They were themes that had been circulating in non-Jewish communities for hundreds of years. During Ford's life, one of the most recently repackaged collections of anti-Semitic propaganda was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols were a series of fabricated meeting minutes summarizing the gathering of Jewish masterminds as they plotted to control the non-Jewish world. They were created by the secret police in Tsarist Russia in the late 1890s to scapegoat the suffering of the Russian people away from the monarchy and onto Russia's vulnerable Jewish population. The Protocols were never used as their creators initially intended, and the Russian monarchy would be brutally ended before their contents began widely circulating among non-Jewish communities around Europe. They would also be repackaged yet again to great and terrible success just a few years later in the United States. Pip and Leibold were now in constant conflict over editorial control at The Independent, and shouting matches between them could frequently be heard throughout the offices at the paper. After a long battle he was always destined to lose, E.G. Pip finally resigned his position at the Dearborn Independent in April 1920. Pip's tipping point was Ford's desire to start a new educational series to let some air in on the Jewish question. With Ford's blessing and financial support, Leibold hired dozens of investigators to keep tabs on Jews and other important people all around the world. He hired private investigators in Germany to report Jewish activity within the country post-World War I. He hired former Secret Service agents and the former head of U.S. Army intelligence. He even investigated 3 U.S. presidents under the suspicion that they were somehow compromised by Jewish influence. Pip departed from the paper in opposition to the slander he knew was just around the corner. His old colleague Billy Cameron would stay on, translating the real and imagined information from Leibold's agents into propaganda consumable at a 6th grade reading level. Cameron considered himself a British Israelite, a Christian movement that believed Jesus was not a Jew, but the Anglo-Saxon forefather of the European peoples of Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia. They believed these nationalities to be the ruling people of the world, and saw Jews of the time as pretenders to God's white Christian throne. It was basically a white supremacist Bible study group. Cameron remained with the Independent through its entire run, personally writing up most of the anti-Jewish propaganda that would appear in its pages over the years to come. On May 22, 1920, the Independent began a run of 91 consecutive articles baselessly vilifying Jewish people. In a sentence that is one part classic anti-Semitism and one part unintentional self-projection, the first article described the all-powerful Jewish cabal as a corporation with agents everywhere. It even maligned Jewish influence on stricken Germany, warning that America would suffer next unless the proud Gentile population rose up against the few supermen of a long-despised race. The protocols of the Elders of Zion had gradually increased their circulation around Europe, but had yet to gain significant traction in the United States. In late May or early June of 1920, a stenographer in Washington, D.C. made an English copy of the protocols at the behest of Independent contributor and last person to hear what happened to Nicholas II in that basement, Boris Brassel. Brassel provided Ernest Leibold with access to both versions of the text, but Leibold passed on access to the original over concerns that possessing it would put a greater burden on the Independent to prove its authenticity. The misinformation in the protocols was never published in its entirety within the Independent. The lies from the original text about an all-powerful Jewish hierarchy were often recontextualized around actual powerful Jewish people or in reference to major world events at the time. It was a more curated presentation of unhinged farcical nonsense, and stamping it all with Henry Ford's seal of approval gave the whole thing a much more believable framing than it had ever had before. The hard turn taken into hate speech at the Independent received significant pushback in its time. Cities such as Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Boston, and New York all made attempts at some point to have the paper banned. Many libraries refused to carry it, and those that did frequently found their copies had been stolen and destroyed. After his departure from the Independent, E.G. Pip started up Pip's Weekly, a small publication attempting to directly confront the lies put forth in the Independent week in and week out. But all these efforts barely slowed the paper down, and Ford's power and influence ensured that the Independent kept making its way onto newsstands, thrown in with cars sold at his dealerships, and delivered directly to thousands of subscribers across the country. After months of attacks targeting the world's Jewish population, the first series of anti-Jewish articles from May through October 1920 would be republished in a standalone paperback titled The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. 4 International Jew volumes were eventually published, chronicling the entirety of the Independent's first run of anti-Semitic propaganda. Leibold personally spearheaded the assembly of these collections, and intentionally never copyrighted any of them, hoping this would lead to the greatest possible distribution around the world. They are easily available to this day and went on to be translated into over 15 languages. The most infamous printings were the dozens of editions published in Germany starting in the early 1920s, and they were spread throughout the country by the same person that would cap off Henry Ford's big birthday bash and attempt to conquer all of Europe almost 20 years later. The second anti-Semitic article in The Independent claimed that the armistice after World War I and the collapse of the German economy were the direct result of a global Jewish conspiracy. It described the Jews themselves as an infection, insisted in the flesh of Germany's body politique, and bemoaned the lack of national hygiene within the country. The International Jew gained widespread exposure in Germany on name recognition alone, and when Henry Ford enthusiastically laid the blame for all of Germany's problems directly at the feet of its Jews, countless future members of Hitler's political movement were very ready to believe him. Ford had literally written the handbook that Hitler would use to build his entire career, and by winter 1922, Nazi Party headquarters was home to a table filled with German copies of The International Jew and a large portrait of Henry Ford in Hitler's office. The second edition of Hitler's memoir name-dropped Ford specifically, commending him for his ongoing campaign against Jews in America. In 1931, when a Detroit News reporter asked Hitler about Ford's portrait in his office, Hitler replied, "I regard Ford as my inspiration." In late 1922, as rumors circulated about Ford considering a presidential run, Hitler told the press that he wished he could send some of my shock troops to Chicago and other American cities to help in the elections. We look to Heinrich Ford as the leader of the growing fascist movement in America. After nearly 2 years of uninterrupted anti-Semitic attacks in the Independent, Ford ordered an abrupt end to his assault in January 1922. His reputation had finally become tarnished by his work at the Independent, and he needed to begin clearing the way for his political and financial future. If he ever wanted to make a serious run for the presidency, he had no path to victory at the time without significant Jewish American support. Model T sales were also slowing down across the board, and his market share was shrinking faster than ever in Jewish-heavy population centers like New York. In an effort to respond to the declining sales and create some positive press that had nothing to do with the Independent, Ford purchased the Lincoln Motor Company in February 1922. Edsel Ford had spearheaded the acquisition, and his public announcement of the deal highlighted the struggle that would define his working relationship with his father for the rest of his career. My father makes the most popular car in the world. I want to make Lincoln the best car in the world. Ford's crusade in the Independent might have been put on hold, but his personal feelings toward Jewish people didn't skip a beat. In an August 1922 interview with the Detroit Free Press, he proudly declared his resentment for the greed and avarice of Wall Street c***s. But even his hiatus from printing propaganda would end in due time. A new era of hate at the Independent was about to begin, and it would focus on prominent Jewish businessman Aaron Sapiro. Aaron Sapiro was born in 1885 in Oakland, California. Not unlike Ford, he rose from humble beginnings, tried to improve people's lives, and eventually became too rich and powerful to give even a single shit. He graduated from law school in 1911 and spent the next 5 years studying legal co-ops to help California farmers organize collectively. In 1922, he created the National Council of Farmers Cooperative Marketing Association. Within a few years, he represented over 60 farming co-ops and brought in revenue of over $400 million annually. Sapiro began to treat the farmers he represented more poorly as his power over them increased, and his influence over agriculture was yet another reason he ended up firmly in the sights of Henry Ford. Ford had preferred fiddling with machines to working the fields of his family's farm growing up, but he never lost his fondness for people who spent their lives working the land. He pitched his cars as a way to help rural communities gain greater access to the world, and those communities bought into the Model T in a big way. They gained a strong appreciation for a man who really had improved their quality of life. With Model T sales still slowing down, his dedicated customer base in rural America was a line of business he couldn't afford to lose. Ford needed someone he could easily vilify to small-town America, and a Jewish businessman already known for putting the screws to many of the farmers who had helped build his fortune was an impossible target to ignore. In April 1924, The Independent launched a second wave of anti-Semitic articles that didn't let up for the rest of the year, and many of them were directly focused on Aaron Sapiro. At a glance, caring about Ford's fight with Sapiro feels like rooting for exactly one billionaire to be the first to get a colonoscopy in low Earth orbit. I get it, it's a tough sell. If Jeff Bezos tragically burns up on re-entry someday, I'll use Prime Shipping to buy the world's smallest violin and play Danny Boy while pouring the bottle of delivery urine it came with over his richly appointed grave. Never forget that Henry Ford has been playing with matches in the fireworks factory this whole time. Even if Sapiro is the owner of Black Cat Amusement Explosives Incorporated, the people who are about to lose everything are the ones living in the wood and tinder tenements down the block. Ford's attacks against Jews were never meant to strike a blow against entrenched positions of power. Racial and ethnic agitation is always used to shift blame from powerful groups and onto vulnerable ones. Not always, but yes, actually literally always. Dehumanizing language inevitably gets people hurt, and it can eventually get them killed. In January 1925, Sapiro sent a formal letter to Ford demanding an immediate retraction of the attacks made against him in The Independent. The attacks continued until April, and 10 days later, Sapiro sued Ford and The Independent for defamation. On March 15, 1927, Sapiro's case would finally go to trial. In addition to his legal staff, Ford's defense team was supplemented by around 50 private investigators deployed throughout the courthouse. Ford's agents pushed every boundary they could trying to subvert the trial. Sapiro's lawyers claimed in court that Ford's men had tapped phone lines, bugged courthouse offices, searched people's bags as they moved throughout the building, and sent threatening notes to prospective jurors. In late March 1927, just before he was set to testify in the trial, Ford claimed he was sideswiped by 2 men while driving near his estate on Michigan Avenue. Ford's car was found smashed into a tree 15 feet off the roadway, but there were no witnesses to the crash, and Ford walked away from the accident and returned to his home immediately after it on foot. He was taken to his own hospital and held for evaluation for 2 days. An initial statement from the Ford Motor Company denied foul play in the crash, but cited Ford's injuries as too severe to allow him to testify before the court. When Sapiro's lawyers finally petitioned the court to appoint a doctor to verify the seriousness of Ford's condition, the motion was ultimately denied. While Ford had been kept off the stand due to his accident, Harry Bennett, head of private security at the Ford Motor Company and future tiger-wrangling crazy person, still had his job cut out for him. His current assignment was to lead Ford's army of hired goons to disrupt the trial by any means necessary, and protect other high-profile members of Ford's organization. The day after Ernest Leibold was called to testify, Bennett produced sworn statements by 14 Ford Motor Company employees claiming that juror Cora Hoffman had lied during the jury selection process and had been, quote, offered a bribe by a Jew. The judge ordered that no details of the allegation be released publicly until it could be independently verified, at which point Bennett immediately leaked the allegation to the Detroit Times. Hoffman defended herself in an interview with the Times, stating, "It seems to me that someone is trying to keep this case away from the jury." The judge determined that Hoffman's comments to the press were an expression of bias, declared a mistrial, and rescheduled the case to September 1927. By mid-1927, Henry Ford was once again facing heat on all fronts. The rescheduled Sapero trial was fast approaching, and Model T sales had declined to among the worst they'd ever been. The Model A, a project started by Edsel to replace the now woefully out-of-date Model T, was scheduled to release by the end of the year. Like his first pullback in 1922, Ford needed the media to stop covering his unsightly fixations on hate speech and start hyping up the new car that would determine the future of his company. Ford began negotiations with prominent Jewish groups and came back to the table with Sapero's legal team. He released a public apology for his years of spreading anti-Semitic propaganda and quickly agreed to an out-of-court settlement with Aaron Sapero. In December 1927, the Model A was released and the Dearborn Independent finally shut its doors for good. It was the end of Ford's years-long crusade to stigmatize Jews in the United States. But the lies he helped spread overseas were now fueling the rise of an unchecked fascist movement in Germany. In his autobiography, Ford described labor movements in America as a determined effort to fashion the Bolshevik stain to American labor. He later called unions a neat thing for a Jew to have on hand when he comes around to get his clutches on industry. On January 26, 1933, while speaking to the London Evening Standard, Ford responded to a spontaneous 2,000-person walkout at Briggs Manufacturing, a supplier providing car bodies to the Ford Motor Company. Ford attributed the walkout to certain bankers who he claimed caused the shutdown to gain control of his factories. The workers who walked off the job were, in fact, fed up with their extremely poor working conditions and their criminally low average pay of 9 cents per hour. On January 30th, 4 days after Ford's interview, Adolf Hitler would be declared Chancellor of Germany. Hitler quickly cracked down on almost all freedoms in Germany, including his own push against organized labor. By the end of 1933, thousands of books were burned, civil liberties were suspended, and all existing trade unions in Germany were abolished. But Hitler's grandest plan of all was a massive rearmament effort in defiance of the restrictions that had been imposed upon Germany since the end of World War I. A few years earlier, Ford had opened a large plant in Cologne to try and build a lasting hold in the German auto market. Ford cars at the time made up less than 6% of all cars sold in Germany. Opel, the German subsidiary of Ford's hometown nemesis General Motors, accounted for around 50%. By June 1933, the International Jew was in its 29th German printing, prominently featuring Henry Ford's name on the front page. It was Ford's most successful German export to date, but it would be easily outdone by the massive manufacturing effort Ford's company was about to take on to help fuel the Nazi war machine in Europe. After 1933, Ford US increased its stake in Ford Germany and supported management's efforts there to bend over backwards for the new Nazi government. As a show of goodwill, Ford US and Ford England went out of their way to source some of their parts from German suppliers. When the Nazi rearmament effort faced supply chain issues due to post-World War I restrictions, Ford Germany imported huge stockpiles of raw materials and manufacturing equipment and diverted significant portions of them to non-Ford manufacturers around the country. By 1938, Ford Germany's sales had tripled, and its capitulation to Hitler had yielded major government contracts. In June 1938, the Reich ordered over 3,000 Ford trucks to use for their planned occupation of Czechoslovakia. To fulfill the order, Ford US secretly delivered pre-built components to their Cologne facility for rapid assembly during special overnight shifts. 1 month later, Hitler presented Ford with the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, which he graciously and enthusiastically accepted. In August 1915, when the US had still not yet involved itself in World War I, Ford strongly denied his company's potential involvement in the conflict, stating, "I would never let a single automobile get out of the Ford plant anywhere in the world if I thought it was going to be used in warfare." By the mid-1940s, almost every Ford facility in Europe would be contributing most of its resources to the German war effort. As the Allied nations made their own early plans to fight back against the Nazi advance across Europe, Ford flatly refused to provide them with the same level of support. In mid-June 1940, Henry Ford abruptly withdrew from an agreement brokered by the U.S. government to build around 6,000 aircraft engines for Great Britain. When the U.S. prepared to make its own entry into the conflict and began conscripting private U.S. manufacturing for the war effort, Ford was asked again about his company's potential war production in America. "That's the law of the land, isn't it?" he unenthusiastically replied. Ford's clashes with the U.S. government probably had a lot to do with the current administration's stance on organized labor. The Wagner Act, passed in 1935, guaranteed most U.S. workers the right to form a union. Bolstered by this new unprecedented support, the United Auto Workers held their first meeting in Detroit in May 1935. Strikes quickly followed, and sit-downs at GM and Chrysler led to hard-fought collective bargaining agreements that significantly improved conditions for the newly unionized workers. By 1937, the UAW had over 400,000 members. With two of the big three down, The last major target for unionization in Detroit was the Ford Motor Company. In the New York Times on April 14, 1937, Ford said he had never given the Wagner Act a second thought. He again decried unions as tools of the wire pullers, backed by war-seeking financiers and the Wall Street crowd. For years, Ford's massive River Rouge factory complex had been run as a private police state. It was controlled by the Ford Service Department, the company's private security force led by Ford's personal extrajudicial fixer, Harry Bennett. Bennett was a former Navy diver, ex-lightweight boxer, and generally unhinged lunatic, and his willingness to do pretty much anything in the service of Henry Ford paid off handsomely. He used some of his considerable compensation to build a personal fortress near Ann Arbor, Michigan. It was filled with live lions and tigers, hidden rooms, escape tunnels, trick staircases, and gun turrets manned by armed guards. Bennett eventually ran the entire Rouge complex, and he kept workers in line with immediate firings and violent crackdowns at the first sign of insubordination. In January 1928, the New York Times called Ford an industrial fascist, the Mussolini of Detroit. By the mid-1930s, some Ford workers darkly joked that Hitler had conceived of his Gestapo by basing it on Bennett's Ford Service Department. Conditions in the Rouge factory were harsh from the moment it opened. Shifts would be pitted against each other to meet ever-rising production quotas. Conveyor belts would gradually increase in speed to dial into the absolute maximum output that workers could achieve at the expense of their health and safety. Workers were allowed a single break per shift lasting exactly 15 minutes. Talking with other workers or sitting down at any point, even during breaks, were both fireable offenses. On March 7, 1932, thousands of workers gathered in Detroit to march on the River Rouge complex. Their demands included rehiring workers laid off as a result of the ongoing depression, racial equality in hiring and promotions, and the right to vote for collective bargaining. As the unarmed crowd approached the Dearborn city limits, they were confronted by Dearborn police and the Ford Service Department. The police launched tear gas into the crowd, and after a Dearborn police officer fired his gun at the protesters, the crowd scattered into a field and began picking up rocks and throwing them at the police. The march regrouped and continued on toward the factory, where police and Ford service agents began openly firing on the protesters. As they fled from the hail of gunfire, Harry Bennett drove up toward the now retreating workers, rolled down his window, and fired a pistol into the crowd. In the aftermath of the Ford massacre, dozens of workers were injured, and 5 of them were killed. No Dearborn police officers or Ford service members were ever held accountable for the killings. It was more clear than ever that Ford's treatment of his workers was beyond unacceptable. On May 26, 1937, several UAW representatives, including Walter Reuther and Richard Frankenstein, met on a bridge leading to the River Rouge factory to hand out information between shifts. They were quickly confronted by over a dozen of Bennett's men who told them to get the hell off of Ford property, then attacked them from behind as they turned to speak with some of the reporters that were covering the union activity. They were severely beaten and repeatedly picked up and thrown to the ground. The photographers covering the incident were also attacked by Ford security, and any camera equipment they got their hands on was immediately destroyed. The clash became known as the Battle of the Overpass, and the photos that did make it out further galvanized the UAW into fighting for justice and equality at the Ford Motor Company. After the UAW started gaining traction in Detroit, workers' lunch pails, lockers, and clothing were now subject to search by Ford security at any time. Workers found with union literature were frequently beaten on the spot. From 1937 to 1941, Bennett would fire more than 4,000 people suspected of having union ties in the River Rouge complex. In 1941, the Supreme Court finally ruled in favor of the UAW and the National Labor Relations Board against the Ford Motor Company. On April 1, 1941, more than 50,000 people at the Lincoln, Highland Park, and Rouge plants walked off the job. 6 weeks later, 70% of Ford workers voted for the union. When he learned the results of the vote, Henry Ford ordered Edsel to shut the company down for good. After his wife Clara threatened to sell her shares of the company and divorce him if he refused to compromise, Ford finally relented. He sent Edsel to negotiate with the union, and on June 20, 1941, the Ford Motor Company signed its first union contract. I wanted to pause here for a minute to give you some advanced warning as we start to wrap things up. We've covered some pretty intense stuff so far, but things are about to get way, way worse. There's going to be slavery and death and violations of human rights all the way down until we finally make it to the end of this extremely long video. If you need a break before things really get ugly, please step away now and come back when you're ready to bear witness to the Ford Motor Company's worst activities in Nazi Germany. In 1939, as another act of good faith to the Nazi government, Ford Germany renamed itself to Ford Work AG as a symbol of its wholly German identity. The Ford Motor Company continued to own a majority stake in Ford Germany and consistently relayed their wishes to German management throughout World War II. After the U.S. declared war on Germany and direct contact with their German subsidiary became illegal, back channels were maintained to keep tabs on all of Ford's European business interests. Information was passed by way of Ford France after Paris fell to Germany, or through clandestine international meetings, such as in June 1943 when U.S. Ford executives secretly met with Ford Work management in Portugal. This picture shows Henry Ford and a few of his executives visiting the Cologne facility in 1938, and the person who took it would soon be using most of Ford's European operations to support Hitler's ever-expanding campaign across the continent. Robert Schmidt was a Nazi Party member who had managed Ford Work from the late 1930s through mid-1945. He had been appointed to manage the company jointly by the German government and the Ford Work Board of Directors. His marching orders from both Ford US and the Nazis were essentially the same: make Ford Work and any other Ford facilities that served the Nazi government as productive as humanly possible. After the Nazis had conquered most of Western Europe, Schmidt eventually shared plans with Edsel Ford to bring all Ford plants in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands under his control to serve the German war effort. Edsel responded by commending him for looking out for the company's interests in Europe. A significant amount of the output Ford Work provided for Nazi Germany was achieved using forced labor. The company first established a private labor camp on site with a group of French POWs who arrived at the Cologne plant sometime in 1940. At its height, the camp contained around 2,500 prisoners, and by the time the Cologne plant was liberated in 1945, 50% of its workforce was made up of forced labor. Prisoners held at the Ford camp were sent there from all across Europe. Most were private citizens from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Many were children or teenagers, most commonly young women. Soon after their towns fell, Nazi troops would go door to door looking for able-bodied members of any household in the area to send off to work in German factories. Anyone who resisted or failed to report for their forced labor assignment would have other members of their family killed or taken in their place. As the war progressed and more Germans were sent off to the front, the Ford plant in Cologne became even more dependent on forced labor. In addition to the unskilled workers that were enslaved by Ford from other countries, the Nazi regime proposed using concentration camp labor to fill dozens of available high-skill positions. The Nazis made this proposition to other companies as well, but some did manage to turn them down. Opel also dedicated most of its wartime production to the Nazi war effort, but they were able to successfully push back against using concentration camp labor at their facilities. Ford Work would eventually have around 60 skilled laborers brought in from the Nazi concentration camp in Buchenwald. It remains unknown whether Ford Work management requested the contingent of skilled labor, or if they were compelled by the Reich to take it. Prisoners at the Ford camp were only referred to by their designated number, which they were required to recite at roll call every morning. The barracks housing the prisoners at Ford were not unlike those found in the Nazi-run concentration camps. The only amenities were a small iron stove to provide minimal heat during the night, and a bucket in the center of the room that was used as a communal toilet. Food ration standards for the prisoners were established by the Nazi authorities, and were so low that they even drew some criticism from within the Nazi government. Meals at the camp consisted of small slices of black bread, a pat of margarine, and soup made from warm water mixed with bits of cabbage. Survival at the camp required finding additional sources of food whenever possible. Some prisoners snuck out of the camp at night to steal food from the surrounding farmland. Former prisoners who had shifts doing laundry described wrapping potatoes in sacks of cloth and putting them into the large boiling kettles used to clean the prisoners' clothes to cook them. Medical care was equally negligent. A former German worker at the plant stated that the medical staff there did just enough to prevent epidemics and nothing more. A study after the war of deaths within the camp found that 3 babies, 6, 12, and 18 months old, had died there during the war. At least 11 other Polish and Russian laborers who were between 17 and 21 years old also died in the camp. The causes of each of these deaths remains unknown. Punishment for insubordination ranged from torture to eventual execution. One prisoner caught damaging company equipment to take it temporarily offline was sent to an even more brutal state-run camp for 6 months. He left the Ford facility weighing 65 kilograms and returned weighing close to 30 kilograms. On August 30th, 1943, 2 prisoners were caught by Nazi authorities returning to the camp after looting some clothing from an abandoned home that had been destroyed in a recent bombing raid. On October 4th, 1933, they were executed. At its height, Ford Work produced more than 1,000 trucks per month for the Nazi war effort, as well as many passenger cars for military officers and Hitler's secret police. In 1942, Ford Works production accounted for around 35% of medium trucks used by the German army. Many materials used to build these vehicles were imported through parts exchange agreements with Ford in the US. The production Ford Work contributed to the German war effort would not have been possible without direct support from the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn. After ownership of Ford Work was redistributed in summer 1941, Ford US and Ford Britain still held most of the shares, and German firm IG Farben controlled the rest. IG Farben had ties to the Ford Motor Company in the US, which held a significant stake of their US subsidiary. They had many contracts of their own with the Nazi government, but by far their most infamous was as the manufacturer of Zyklon B gas. Zyklon B was a cyanide-based pesticide invented in the early 1920s. During World War II, it was knowingly provided by IG Farben to the Nazi government to perform mass executions of prisoners in their concentration camps. At facilities like Auschwitz-Birkenau, it would be used to kill more than 1 million people before the end of the war. The same companies who are responsible for bringing you products like these had a direct financial interest in helping to create this. Ford's European subsidiaries made large profits every year of the war except 1945. The net profit of the Ford family during the war years amounted to around $11 million. The dividends from Ford Work due to shareholders in enemy states were not paid out during the war, but were also not confiscated by the Nazis. These funds were left on the books of the post-war Ford Germany and recorded as either loans from shareholders or new equity in the company. In June 1944, as Allied soldiers made their landings on the beaches of Normandy, they were shocked to find that most of the trucks used by the German army were made by Ford and General Motors. When they liberated Cologne in 1945, they were equally stunned to discover many destitute foreign workers still confined behind barbed wire at the Ford Work facility. The Allies worked quickly to restore as much infrastructure as possible in newly freed Germany, including the Ford plant in Cologne, which suffered minimal damage during the war. Most German employees returned to work at Ford Germany as soon as the plant reopened. Only around 40 were prevented from coming back immediately due to Nazi Party ties or actions they took during the war. One of those workers was former Ford Work leader Robert Schmidt. Schmidt was arrested by U.S. troops in June 1945. He was interrogated for around 2 months about Ford Work and IG Farben's activities during the war. After his release, he was evaluated to potentially return to work, and initially denied due to the monstrous conditions he oversaw during the war. While appealing the original decision, he stated that he had pushed the limits of what was possible to care for the laborers in the company's work camp. He also cited a letter from Nazi leadership that chastised him for delaying the destruction of factory equipment as Allied troops began their final advance to Cologne. This defense of company property went over extremely well with remaining Ford leadership in Germany. With their support, Schmidt was cleared for work on October 25, 1947. By the 1950s, Ford Germany was once again completely under the control of the Ford Motor Company. And by 1956, Ford Germany had 8 board members, and Schmidt and 5 others were all holdovers from the Nazi era of the company. Edsel Ford passed away on May 26, 1943. He died of stomach cancer, resulting from ulcers that were believed to have been partially caused by the years of unrelenting stress of working under his father. Edsel had wanted to make a deal with the UAW years before Ford was forced to do so. During the Model T era, when Edsel and some of his engineers presented a prototype to replace the now dated car, Ford examined it, ripped off the door panels, and eventually smashed most of it to pieces. After another disagreement about moving the company forward escalated into a shouting match, Ford ended the conversation by clearing out Edsel's desk and sending him away on the first train to California. He was expected to stay there until Henry Ford personally summoned him home. With Edsel's death, Henry Ford resumed his position as president, but at nearly 80 years old, the future of the Ford Motor Company was now much more uncertain. At one point, Ford is said to have contemplated handing over control of the company to Harry Bennett. Facing pushback from the U.S. government, who still held active defense contracts with the company, as well as pressure from his wife Clara, his daughter-in-law Eleanor, and his own board of directors, Ford would instead support his grandson Henry II to succeed him as president. Henry II officially took the role on March 12, 1947. His first act as president was to fire almost everyone who made up the inner circle that had fueled his grandfather's most racist and violent impulses, starting with the company head of security Harry Bennett and ending with Dearborn independent collaborator Ernest Leibold. After years of severe decline, Henry Ford would die on April 7, 1947. In an unpublished manuscript, Josephine Goman described witnessing Ford suffer one of the many severe strokes he experienced late in his life while viewing footage of Nazi concentration camps in May 1945. This has never been confirmed outside of this anecdote, but I'd like to believe that raw cosmic justice does occasionally exist. I could also believe that Ford never truly understood the evil he was amplifying around the world until he was forced to unblinkingly confront it. I don't have a formula to calculate the exact percentage of responsibility that Henry Ford bears for the millions of Jewish people that were killed in Europe during World War II, but I'm confident that it's way higher than 0. If you had pre-existing admiration for Henry Ford before watching this video, you might be feeling that I only focused on the worst things he ever did. That is absolutely true, but examine that impulse for a moment. What makes you feel so defensive about Ford's legacy? Why is it usually portrayed so positively? Why aren't most of the events covered in this video already common knowledge? At the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village, Ford and his legacy go largely uncriticized. I'm glad that both of those places exist. Visiting them over the years helped me cultivate a lifelong interest in history that ultimately resulted in this video. They are absolutely worth checking out. They contain some fascinating stuff and provide some really good information, but they very deliberately avoid telling the whole truth. Institutions owned by, founded by, or largely funded by billionaires have exactly one take on the rich and powerful: that they are very, very good. They make the world a better place by gracing us with all kinds of stuff. End of conversation. Henry Ford's myth is an intentional construct. As recently as a few years ago, people are still losing their jobs for daring to share extremely factual information about him. If Ford only did good things, there's no reason to change a system that's given us all this great stuff. But if we admit that some of his actions were quite literally horrifying, we begin to ask how things could have turned out differently. Every institution founded by Henry Ford is better off without him. His museum complex is staffed by a more diverse group of people than ever, and their subject matter has expanded to showcase civil rights struggles, encourage interest in STEM education, and highlight artisanal craftsmanship while still housing thousands of fascinating artifacts from America's history. The Ford Motor Company was better off as soon as he was gone. Its diminished business near the end of the Model T era was a largely self-inflicted problem involving, among other things, Ford's unflinching bigotry and his complete inability to compromise. The company has even occasionally tried to make good on its anti-Semitic past. It paid to have Schindler's List aired uncut on live TV in the 90s. That's something, right? If the Ford Motor Company had been controlled by its workers, it would have been way less likely to support a hostile foreign power that they could be conscripted to fight against. They also probably wouldn't have established a private security force to routinely beat themselves. Corporate dictatorships are just as bad as any other authoritarian hierarchy. We shouldn't tolerate them in government, and we shouldn't allow them to rule the largest business empires in the world. Unaccountable authority has a 100% track record of leading to massive abuses of power. How many times do we need to see systemic abuse run wild? How many times do we need to watch hard work and dedication get rewarded with disrespect and hostility? How many people do we have to let die as just another cost of doing business? The battle will never be over. The constant struggle to pull these despicable people out of the stratosphere and back down to Earth will never be complete. We cannot stop fighting to take back as much power as we can through taxation, legislation, and unrelenting collective organization. And to remind us how much there is to lose if we ever relent again, we should never forget the whole truth about people like Henry Ford. Thank you so much for watching this whole thing. It took me almost a year of research, planning, and editing to finally get it done. If you want to help other people check it out, please click on the YouTube buttons and share it with anyone you think might find it interesting. Your support would really help me make another huge project like this again sometime in the future. I did my best to track down pictures of all the relevant players who crossed paths with Ford in this video. I searched for hours to find a picture of Edwin G. Pipp until I found one listing for a physical historical photograph on eBay. This picture appears to have actually been taken by the Ford Motor Company during his time at the Independent. I now own this incredibly specific piece of real physical history. For now, it's a souvenir of a project that took me countless hours to complete. But if anyone out there works at a museum that might be interested in highlighting the extremely complicated side of Henry Ford's history, hit me up. I'll happily provide you with your very first donation.